We are the paradoxical ape. Bipedal, naked, large-brained, long the master of fire, tools, and language, but still trying to understand ourselves. Aware that death is inevitable, yet filled with optimism. We grow up slowly. We hand down knowledge. We empathize and deceive. We shape the future from our shared understanding of the past. CARTA brings together experts from diverse disciplines to exchange insights on who we are and how we got here. An exploration made possible by the generosity of humans like you.
So this really brings to a close our symposium on the role of myth and stories in anthropogeny, exploring the extraordinary role and power of oral traditions and myth in the process of becoming human. We've taken a long journey beginning 1 million years ago, seeking to trace the domestication of fire, which eventually carved out a niche of social time and space for the transmission of myths and stories. And Michael Chazan has given us a wonderful talk on this. No doubt this new form of art and communication transformed early human societies through the exchange of experience, knowledge, and ideas, as in Brian Boyd's presentation. Contributions have identified cultural universals in myths, explaining the origins of humans, animals, landscapes, and ceremonies. I don't think you'll find any traditional society that doesn't have origin myths explaining that in what is the time before ancestors. And this was so essential for binding people together in common understandings about social groups, the environment, and so on. But such myths also attest to the human curiosity, imagination, and interest in quest to explain the unknown, as Brandon Barker, I think, has pointed out very clearly. With the expanded art forms for communication, knowledge of others, social ties, and institutions could be transmitted to form a much larger imaginary communities of cooperators made up of people who do not live contiguously in space. That's my work. The mystical connections between humans and animals are so widely explored in myth and folklore that are often, unfortunately, ignored in the world today. But one wonders, nonetheless, if the minds of animals are organized in story-like formats, as in Danny's wonderfully funny talk, and in the work of Matthias Gunther, who really gave the feeling that you feel in these societies, how people, the integration between humans and animals. And here I can't resist a little extra story. Lorna Marshall told me the Marshall family went to the Bushmen and did some of the early ethnography, John Marshall's wonderful films, Elizabeth Thomas Marshall's great books. And when they went out there, the Bushmen believed, as they do today, that in the past, the time before ancestors, that humans and animals had all their body parts mixed up. And in modern times, they exchanged them and became what they are today and became finished. And when Lawrence Marshall appeared with his very, very heavy chest, hairy chest, they looked at him and they said, "That man isn't finished yet." So myth and folklore not only secure the normative, but play, a possible source of myth and stories, penetrates the traditions of many societies. Tricksters or mythical characters have the pluck to break with societal norms, expanding the imagination of the possible and creating the variation on which cultural evolution draws. And Matthias Gunther's work is superb on this. And one would have to say, when people hear these stories and tricksters doing outrageous things, people sit there and love it and laugh and think about it. They don't say, oh, that's a bad thing to do. And then myth springs eternal to penetrate science, as in the hunting hypothesis. It structures questions asked in research and paths of investigation that follow, sometimes leading to productive outcomes and other times leading to dead ends. Karen Kramer's talk on the hunting hypothesis speaks to this. And while myths can brew trust and make behavior predictable, those explaining plagues and disasters can also challenge trust, social relations, and institutions, as Mark Honigsbang has, clearly shown us in tracing the history of plagues. With social media and digital communication, myths proliferate in the modern world, as in QAnon and Pizzagate, as Timothy has wonderfully showed us. And fortunately, he is looking at ways to analyze the structure of these things that will give us perhaps some way to counter them. It's often much less costly for people to buy into myths that we know are untrue, and this is through myths in all societies, in order to express social solidarity. It is much less costly to buy into something that's untrue than to question them and experience social exclusions. And these are attitudes that we certainly see in vaccine hesitancy. So to conclude, myth is like a river that flows out of the past through the lives of people in all societies, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse. And to conclude, I would like to thank all the speakers, Danny and I would, and the imaginary community formed by the CARTA symposiums. None of this would be possible without the magicians who managed to pull together the meetings without a glitch. Linda Nelson, Pascal Gagneux, Jesse Roby, Lindsay Hunter, and Kay Kaya. They are truly awesome. And it is such a joy to return to face-to-face gatherings that so mirror the format of our deep evolutionary past. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to begin with some questions that we've received. If you still have some questions, you can give it to a CARTA member for specific of our speakers. And so maybe I can ask the speakers to come forward. As do Brian, the first question with a follow-up comes to you. And you mentioned that science tries to get closer to the truth, maybe. But what about when science is maliciously used to distort the truth, if you have some thoughts on that? And a very related question was about if science challenges us in the way other kinds of stories don't. Do you think that scientific thinking is fundamental and inevitable, or is it an unnatural part of human nature?
Science does try to get closer to the truth, and it gets there by constantly allowing itself to be challenged. Sometimes there is such a cohesion of wrong ideas, like racism or sexism, that the challenge doesn't come through early enough. But in time, science gets corrected and manages to discard the old ideas when there's evidence against them. So I don't think
I don't think that it's science that is itself malicious. It's simply that it's a powerful tool that can be used either for good or for ill, like any tool. So I don't think there's a maliciousness in science. It's just that science is human. It's therefore fallible, and it can be used the wrong way at times. If science challenges in a way stories do not, do you think scientific thinking is a fundamental, inevitable, or unnatural to human nature? Well, certainly observation and explanation through myth and stories seem to be an innate part of human nature. So we try to explain things. In the past, we tried to explain things through agents who were perhaps unseen, through spirits and gods and so on. And that seemed to satisfy us. And it took a very long time for things to come. First, perhaps in the 5th century BCE Greece, when Xenophanes and Democritus started to question the stories of the gods as explanation. But it really took until the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries where that became really established. There were scientific elements in other communities in China, in India, in the Middle East, but all those things came together as a sufficiently robust science to endure only in Europe in the just after the Renaissance, and I think. One of my theories is that science is actually unnatural. It requires us to reject our beliefs, which is not. Usually, we want to hang on to our beliefs, and science, in that sense, is deeply unnatural, and that's why things like evolution, say, are very, very hard for many people to grasp.
Thank you. Next question is for Dr. Barker, if you want to join us, and. This audience member wanted to know whether in the effort to catalog mythemes, is that how you pronounce that, mythemes? How you don't wind up falling into the same trap of previous researchers of allowing biases like gender, etc., to influence the ways in which you actually, folklorists, catalog.
Yeah. That's a really good question, and I think I have a two-part answer. The first is, if it comes across that I'm pleased or supporting the old indexes whenever I find them represented in newer forms of intellectual activity, that isn't what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is there's a continuity that we need to question and be concerned with. So that's on dealing with the indexes and finding a way to map them onto current intellectual work. And then as a folklorist, my solution to that is to simply go to the places and speak to the people and speak to the attitudes and speak to the areas that weren't included in those old indexes and make sure that they are included in future iterations.
Very good. Thank you for that. Yeah, and I think important point about that is that looking at the structural alignment in the work that you do of existing motifs and folk tales and how that maps on to current work is enlightening in and of itself with all of its biases. The next question's for you, Dr. Polly. See you furiously working on that there. And the question one of the questions from the audience is about the storytelling about people who live in distant places, and the question is, how often do storytellers impersonate in specific individual peoples? How often do they actually do impressions through skillful mimicry, or are these all more generic forms described more objectively? Or do their traits simply emerge from the nature of the stories?
The pantomime is to die for. It has everybody rolling on the ground. You know, stories in Bushman stories, they don't have to be actually factually completely true, but they have to ring true. And it's the pantomime that makes them ring true because they capture the character of the person. And so, yes, I mean, the stories have extraordinary amount of pantomime.
Thank you. And there was a kind of a interesting additional question that sort of a follow-up question, but this individual thinks of fire as, you know, a component of the local environment, and they just was curious about your thoughts about maybe situations in which stories aren't told around fires. Do other local environmental factors influence the context and the quality of storytelling?
Okay, in the past, people were really busy in the day and working all the time, hunting and gathering, and I had very few stories. Today, I've also studied modern stories, and people, they can't make a living from hunting and gathering, and many of them have no occupation, and they sit around all day and drink tea with maybe 6 teaspoons of sugar. And so I would say what replaces the fire and they also tell stories at night, but in the day, what replaces the fire for stimulus would be tea and sugar.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And Matthias, the next question is for you. And this question relates to the etymology, believe it or not, of the word therianthrope. And specifically what therian means and where the whole phrase comes from, and a little bit more about that.
Well, it's from Greek. Theri is animal, and anthrop is human. And the term's been around in folklore for quite a while, I think, but it gained real prominence through the work of David Lewis Williams, who is a South African archaeologist who has studied Bushman mythology, especially the context, and also Bushman rock art. And he brought this into the parlance of people like myself who study San mythology and cosmology. Yeah.
Great. And there's a follow-up question, which is they just wanted to know the name of the book that you mentioned a few times that you just completed.
Oh, it's 2 volumes. Very weighty. Human-animal relationships in San and hunter-gatherer cosmology. And then the first volume is about therianthropes and transformation, and the second looks phenomenologically at the experience bodily and through the imagination of transformation of the human-animal kind. So the second volume looks at, has a section on the Eastern Inuit as a comparison, and also a section on Western perceptions of the human-animal relationship, including Rot Peter, Red Peter. So anyway, there's. I wasn't going to do a plug on my book, but I've done it.
Thank you. The next question is for Karen, Dr. Kramer. And one question was whether there was any evidence to suggest that, or that women or children do any kind of participating in hunting in addition to gathering. So is there a role, what role do they play in the entire hunting process or procurement of meat, et cetera, processing?
Okay, there's a fair literature on that. Women and children, especially shellfish, if you want to call that game, they are very, you can sort of see that as being analogous to gathering. Small, something we don't find in the archaeological record because it's not going to preserve, are small game, so little mice or lizards or little rodents. Kids definitely spend a lot of time going after those kinds of food items, both girls and boys. And then certainly as women get to be older, once there's, Usually there's a time allocation conflict between women of reproductive age taking care of children and hunting larger game. So we do get, certainly in the hunters and gatherers that I work with, the women who hunt larger game are usually older post-reproductive women. So you get it kind of and it can be very opportunistic. We have some great ethnographic examples of Agta women taking out their digging sticks, and very opportunistically, if they see something, they can immediately sort of turn that into a bow and opportunistically hunt, dispatch game. So there certainly are. There is not a rigid. There is a division of labor, but I would not call it black and white or rigid.
Right. And another short question, just maybe briefly, was. A number of people asked if there was some just quick information you could share about the rough caloric, intake from gathered food versus meat in some of the societies that you've studied.
Well, certainly a very valuable resource that is really underrepresented both in ethnographies and in the archaeological record are underground storage organs. So roots, tubers, corms, those kinds of foods. They are highly variable around the world in terms of their fat and their protein content. And in South America, at least, they are very dense, caloric, and have a fair amount of protein in them, in contrast to many of the much larger tubers, especially that the Hadza access. There's a great deal of variety, but there are some nuts are very valuable, seeds are very valuable calorically.
Great. Thank you.
If not tests, what, if anything, would convince you that other animals tell stories?
Well, I thought the end of my talk made it clear that I think animals are telling stories and certainly will be through AI. We have a large history. So what would convince me, this wasn't a talk that I was giving about whether or not animals can tell stories. It was a talk really about the stories that humans tell about animals telling stories. And that's a Gordian knot that I implicitly at least suggest will never be cut. It's the ambiguity that's inherent in our higher order projections, our anthropomorphisms of animals, as witnessed by all the folk tales and storytelling for all time and place, are surely evidence that if we really think that a chimpanzee signing is not a rich projective space for the human mind to operate, then we may need to go back to some of the folkloric indexes, even the ones that Brandon and I have created to match together the folk tales and the science. So,
from your talk, I take it that you don't see ability to make fire was a prerequisite for Homo erectus to migrate out of Africa, or Neanderthals and Denisovans to survive in cold climates. How do you think they pulled off these feats? Other tech such as animal skin clothing, something else? Or was it opportunistic use of naturally occurring fire enough? Here's your question.
So my first thing is that as a scientist, I could be completely wrong, right? That I'm very upfront about it. This is what I can support based on current data. Current data, one of the most fascinating things is where we have zero evidence of fire is in Europe for Homo erectus, which is weird. So then you say, well, how did they pull it? What is the way of life that would allow a hominin creature to survive in Georgia without fire? And I have to say, without tools that are designed particularly for scraping or preparing hides. That's also absent. So it's a puzzle, and I don't want to brush it away by saying, oh, here's an answer. Possibilities include high degree of mobility, so that maybe you are seasonally mobile over long distances. But I think particularly when we look at Neanderthals in glacial climates, I don't know the answer to that. How do you get by, even if you're a Neanderthal, with preserving and keeping fire? How does this work? And Harold Dibble, who passed away a few years ago, actually was showing that there's an opposite relationship, that you find less fire on Neanderthal sites in colder periods because there's less biomass to catch fire, and there's less fuel is one potential reason. But I think that's one of these questions we don't really have a grasp of yet, how that aspect of their lives worked. So there's still problems to figure out. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So the next one is for Mark. In regard to anti-science medicine movements in the U.S., I have observed a closing of the circle between political extremes, particularly in language and studies coming from the social sciences. What can we do? What language do we need to use to avoid furthering anti-science/medicine sentiment while also furthering post-colonial research? How can science medicine better work with the social sciences to reduce anti-science medicine sentiment?
My answer will be very short. We need to tell better stories about science. That's the answer. Albeit recognizing that sometimes, as Brian just mentioned, science sometimes gets its own stories wrong, but it is a self-correcting mechanism. The point about anti-science or pseudoscience or conspiracy theories is that what makes them alluring is they tell good stories, and their narratives are by definition incapable of being disproved. A conspiracy theory is something that can't be disproved. It's similar to religion. You can't disprove a religious belief. And this goes right back to the turtles, when I forget the Greek who actually thought, well, maybe the world isn't resting on a turtle. Maybe we're just floating, The problem with that is it introduces uncertainty, contingency, and a lot of people find that very unsettling. And that's my answer. It's difficult to address. I don't think we do it through networks. I think we do it through getting much better at scientists at telling these stories. I mean, we've got examples now today. I mean, people like Peter Hotez is the standout example, I would say. But they're behind all these networks, there are storytellers who are making a lot of money out of weaving, these confections, a bit of science here, a bit of, and that's the problem. And it's all amplified by the internet and social media. I don't know if that answered the question. It seemed to be getting at colonialism and other things too. But medicine doesn't have a great record on this. If you look, you ask why. I mean, I alluded to this in my talk. Why? Obviously there's vaccine hesitancy across society, but it was noticeable that groups who maybe don't share the benefits or don't have a good experience of accessing medicine, or who have historically experienced, oppression through medicine, of course they're more distrustful. Of course they're going to hesitate to take vaccines. So that's something that medicine itself has to acknowledge and, make reparations for. Thank you.
Okay, so I have some more here. This is for Matthias. Is there less theory anthropic cave art early on in prehistory compared to later?
I'm sorry.
You can read, yeah.
Is there less theanthropic cave? Is there less theanthropic cave art early on in prehistory compared to later? I would say I don't know so much as much as I should it's a new thing I want to get into, about the Upper Paleolithic art. I don't think that motif is all that frequent. There's a famous Le Trois Frères, the sorcerer, shaman figure. But in terms of Sandrock art, the therianthropic motif is, I don't think there's any less or any more throughout the centuries and millennia even that this art has been produced. It's the therianthropic motif, even though it is found universally in the art, is not that common. I mean, most of the depictions of animals are actual animals, and there's also quite a few humans. But interspersed amongst them very often on the same multi-figure panel, you've got animals and humans, real ones, and then here and there the therianthrope in amongst them. Yeah. So I think there's no change in the frequency of this motif over the centuries.
I think one extra interesting study I know was by Thomas Dowson. He studied figures portrayed in art before the arrival of the Bantu populations into the area, and they were all stick figures. And then after the arrival of the Bantu, people began to portray themselves Bushmen as Bushmen, their bodies filled out, their decorations and so on. So interaction with another group led to a very different portrayal and contrast. So that's an interesting point. Okay, the next one is, again for Mark. Oh, here goes. Driving cars is a similar tenet in terms of social trust. Hence why we get so angry when someone violates traffic laws. In Arizona, they shoot, both spoken and unspoken. How do you think self-driving cars will impact the society's trust structure regarding transportation?
Very simple. Don't trust AI. It's evil. No, I mean, more serious answer. I mean, AI just reflects our own biases, right? I think you showed that very eloquently when you ran What Would the Chimp Say through AI. I suppose, what I didn't talk about in my talk is that, distrust is also very valuable and important. That serves an important social function, and it's at the heart of science, right? Questioning, distrust, and conspiracy theories are driven by the fact that science has not always acknowledged the social context and the biases that are inherent in some of the the research choices. I mean, I think vaccines are particularly prone to this because, vaccinology is the classic example of an applied empirical science, but we don't always know exactly how vaccines work or produce their protective effects. We know using epidemiology that they do have these effects, but we can't always say precisely why. So I think, I've got off self-driving cars, haven't I? So I'm going tangent. But yeah, I don't think we will know. I think that, like most things, we'll grow to trust self-driving cars because presumably when the technology gets right, they will reduce accidents. I'm particularly looking forward to it because it means I'll be able to read a book while traveling. Thank you.
Do cave pictographs and evidence of fire in caves represent the most ancient, tangible evidence of myth transmission?
That's hard. So cave art is a much later phenomenon, and just following up maybe on some of what Matthias was saying, there's an issue in Africa that we can't really date the rock art. And the amount of research that's been done in southern Africa, at least, but all of Africa really, given the landmass compared to Europe, it's just a staggering difference of intensity of research. And what that means is that for, southern Africa, which I'm beginning to know, the amount that we don't know is quite overwhelming. So, for example, how early are there these animal things? I can't answer that question. When are there sites where you first get fire and rock art in Africa? I don't know. We just don't have the data yet because of the lack of intensity. I know that at Wonderwerk we have human occupation going back about in the later Stone Age, the ancestral sun, going back about 15 to 20,000 years. But whether the rock art is that old, don't know yet. So I can't really answer. Yeah.
I was just interested if Tim's undergraduate team did any research on positive agents towards either January 6th or the pandemic. Did he look at the messaging from the CDC and how that spread? In other words,
have we looked at
elements of trying to
yes, I mean we have
vaccinations or saying that
right. So we actually did work a little bit with the CDC on messaging. The problem with the CDC messaging was, as a folklorist, when I sat down to sort of take apart their anecdote that they were telling in their pamphlets that they were handing out to new parents, which I was at that time. Was the message they had was that we're not 100% sure about the science, right? So they were giving the wrong message in anecdote form. They were bringing statistics to a story fight. You never do that, right? You bring stories to a story fight. And you need to have stories that are tuned to the beliefs of the different communities that you're working with, right? So that each community is different. They've got different beliefs, they've got different fears, they've got different needs. And so you do need to tailor stories to that. If that's something that we found, going even back archivally with the storytelling. As far as the parlor data goes, we really just were focused on the parlor data. We weren't sure what we were going to find. We had an idea. We didn't realize that it would be this semantically consistent and that the ideas for a march on the Capitol emerged so early on in the discussion. So that was what we were focused on there. But yes, you could use it for positive too.
I can see organizers pacing, so it's time.
Yeah.
It's time to break up. Thank you all for all of your attention.
I just would like to say a few words. I want to close the symposium by thanking everybody, the speakers, the organizers, you, the audience here and online. And I'd like to remember a very close friend, Annette Merle-Smith, who for many, many years has been a champion for CARTA. She has supported the Salk Institute as well. And within CARTA, she's been supporting the symposia, the student fellowships, very importantly, allowing many of the graduate students to add anthropogeny towards their PhD programs. I want to thank those who made the symposium possible. The symposium chairs, thank you both very, very much. Our featured speakers, all our sponsors and supporters, and of course you, the audience. Thank you very, very much and enjoy your weekend.